Hello Greenstylers, Cynthia here to stitch up some Hana Swim shorts with you. These are a super cute design featuring side ruching finished with ties or elastic. Today we'll be making Hana Swim shorts with the enclosed casing option finished with elastic and the mid-rise waistband. Hana was designed for swim fabrics with at least 75% horizontal and 50% vertical stretch. And here are the pieces you'll need to cut. Cut 2 of P1, the front main, as mirror images. Cut on the dotted line on this straight edge for the enclosed casing option and the solid line for the fold-over casing option. Choose between 4 length options and note your choice so that you can cut the same on your other pieces. The longest option is shown here. Cut 2 of P2, the back main, as mirror images. Again, noting the side seam cut line and the length cut lines. We'll also cut 2 mirror images of pieces P3 and P4, the front and back liners, keeping in mind the same side seam and length lines. In this tutorial, we will be using piece C3, the mid waistband. This is a single waistband piece, but if you would like to use the high waistband, cut 1 of piece C1 and 1 of piece C2. We'll begin at the inner leg seams by pairing up one front and back and then the other front and back, so we have 2 legs. Line them up at that inseam and flip one of them over so that they're lined up right along that inseam and pin them in place. Repeat the same exact process with the lining pieces, so now we have 4 pairs. We'll head on over to the sewing machine or serger and stitch up those seams, all 4 of them, with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Trim all the excess threads and we'll head on over to do the crotch seams. Lay one leg on the table with right sides up just like this, and we'll lay the other leg right on top, making sure to match the back with the back and the front with the front. Clip or pin all along that curved crotch seam. Repeat for your lining pieces. Stitch both seams using a stretch stitch or your serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We'll finish those hems by attaching the lining to the main right at the hem. Grab one of your hems and lift it up, so now we see the right side of the bottom of the pants. One of the hems is up here and the other hem is down here. Move the rest of the fabric out of the way so that there's no fabric underneath the raw edge of those hems. And once you've gotten it all straightened out, you're going to bring over your lining piece and you're going to open up the lining piece in just the same way, but instead of right sides up, we're going to put the lining piece right side down so that the 2 pieces are right sides together. You can see that the back pieces are on the right side of the screen and the front pieces are on the left side of the screen. As you line up the lining and the main fabrics, make sure that you're lining up the back pieces of the lining with the back pieces of the main fabric, and so forth with the front pieces. Pin or clip all the way across the hems. We will stitch both of these leg hems using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. For the fold over casing option, stitch both of these seams and then follow the steps starting at page 14 of the tutorial. You can also follow the link in the comments for the fold over casing technique as demonstrated on the Hana Swim top. Now let's get started on the enclosed casing option. You'll see these little marks that I've made here. The two lines indicate where we will be doing a 1/2 inch of straight stitch, and the space in between indicates 3/8 of an inch of no stitching. Once we get past those little lines, we're going to stitch with a stretch stitch all the way across until we get to the other side. And again, we'll have a 1/2 inch of straight stitch, a space of no stitching, and another 1/2 inch of straight stitch. We're going to do the same exact thing on the other hem. 2 straight stitch sections with a non-stitch in between, and then the same on the other side. As you can see, I have the number 1, which is my straight stitch, set up. I'm starting at the very edge and holding onto those thread tails, which will keep the machine from eating my fabric. Backstitch to secure those stitches and stitch right up to the edge of your 1/2 inch line. And then we are going to pull out the fabric once we've backstitched and secured and trim off those threads. Leave that little 3/8 of an inch gap unstitched and then begin stitching again at the second line. Use a straight stitch again, backstitch to secure the stitches and stitch for 1/2 an inch or the remainder of that second line. Then switch over to a stretch stitch and stitch all the way to the other end of that hem. When we get to our next 1/2 inch line, we'll switch over to a straight stitch, stitch for that 1/2 an inch, backstitch to secure the stitches, pull the fabric out, and again trim the threads. Again, leave it that 3/8 inch space unstitched and use your straight stitch to stitch the last 1/2 inch, making sure to backstitch to secure those stitches. Here's how it will look. Straight stitch for the first 1/2 inch, 3/8 of an inch space, straight stitch for the next 1/2 inch, then we have a stretch stitch going all the way across to the other end of the hem. And then when we get to the other end, we transition from stretch stitch to straight stitch for this 1/2 inch, and we have a 3/8 of an inch space and then another straight stitch to the edge of the fabric. After you finished one side, you're going to turn it over and do the same thing on the other side. You may find it helpful to understitch the seam to the lining. What you do is open up your fabric with the wrong side facing up, and you press the seam over toward the lining. You can see my lining is on the right hand side and the seam is all pressed toward the lining. Use a stretch stitch to stitch close to that seam, and this should help keep the lining on the inside so it doesn't try to roll out. If you do add the understitching to those hem seams, don't do it in the first 1.5 inches of that seam. Leave those without any understitching because you don't want to close up the casing openings that you just carefully made. Turn everything right side out, and then we're going to line up the side seams. Don't worry if it takes you a minute to find them. It took me a couple of tries to get it right as well, but once you have them lined up, they'll look just like this. The inseams will create a little opening in the middle. The side seams of the mains will align. The hem that you just created between the main and the lining is in the center of the screen, and then the lining side seams will align as well. We're going to pin along the length of the side seam and make sure to carefully line up those hem seams. Stitch with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to fold everything in half so that wrong sides are touching and we're finally going to look like a pair of shorts. But before I do that, I have a little tip that will help the next step go a little bit easier if you used a serger for that side seam. Find the hem stitch line that is between the main and the lining fabric and snip into that side seam that you've just created right at that hem seam. And the reason we're doing that is so that the two seams can nest next to each other when we turn everything right side out. Just make sure that when you snip into that seam that you are not snipping the left needle thread of your side seam that you just stitched, because you want that side seam to stay intact. You just want to be able to turn one half of the seam toward the left and one half of the seam toward the right. Of course, if you used a sewing machine on those side seams, you can just open them up. Now we're going to stitch right at that side seam, and we're going to stitch the main fabric to the lining fabric right along that seam. It's a pretty simple step. It just can be a little fiddly, so you want to take your time and be patient, and don't worry if you have to repin. So as you can see, my lining fabric seam is pushed toward the right, and so I'm going to find the seam on my main fabric and push that toward the left. And what I want to do is nest those seams right next to each other so that I can pin right in between them, right on those seam lines. And so just line everything up, and then you're going to pin all the way up that seam. When you finish pinning, check inside to make sure that the pins follow the seam line on the lining as well. If you need to adjust anything, simply unpin and repin until they follow the seam line on both the liner and the main. Repeat for the other side seam, and then we'll head on over to the sewing machine. We'll stitch right in that seam, which is called stitch in the ditch, and we'll be using a straight stitch. You shouldn't be able to see that stitch for the most part since it's going to be right in that seam line, but definitely can't see it on my black fabric. Now we're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch away from that seam on either side. Use a stretch stitch such as a lightning bolt or a triple straight stitch. You want to make sure that at the bottom hem you secure those stitches, so if you want you can switch to a straight stitch like I did to do a reverse stitch. And now we'll switch to the other side of the seam and stitch 3/8 of an inch on that side. And here's a close-up of how our pretty little channels look from the outside. Now don't be confused by my choice of pointing tool. I just happen to have a seam ripper sitting next to me. I'm not seam ripping anything, but I'm just showing you that now you can find your little channels that you've created by those little spaces from way back in step 3. And speaking of channels, we're going to go ahead and insert some elastic into those channels now. Use this chart to cut your 4 pieces of 1/4 inch elastic or to cut your fabric for your ties. Insert the pieces of elastic through the bottom of the channels and pull them all the way through. Pin the end of the elastic in place at the bottom hem and then insert the second piece of elastic into the other channel on that same side seam. Now stitch back and forth a few times to secure the ends of the elastic near the hem. Use a straight stitch and stitch about 1/4 inch up to 1/2 inch away from the bottom edge of the shorts. Carefully pull out and snip off any excess elastic that's sticking out the bottom. Now pull the elastic out the top of the pant until you get the amount of ruching that you prefer. At this point, I recommend using safety pins or a basting stitch to secure the top of the elastic while you insert the elastic to the other side. That way you can have the elastic inserted on both sides and try them on before you commit to a permanent stitch on that elastic. But once you are happy with the elastic length on both sides, stitch back and forth a few times with a straight stitch to secure it in place. As much as I love a high-rise waistband, the mid waistband is nice too because it's a single piece and uses up less fabric. Fold the waistband in half, aligning up the short ends, and with right sides together, stitch in place using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then fold the entire waistband in half, aligning the long raw edges and with wrong sides together. Mark the 1/4 points along the raw edges of the waistband. At this point, I recommend basting the liner to the main all along the top of the shorts. It'll make it much easier to attach the waistband. Then mark the 1/4 points on the shorts and slip the waistband onto the outside of the shorts so that right sides are touching. Match up the 1/4 points and you can align the seam of the waistband to the back of the shorts. Stitch them in place using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And that's it. You are all done with your new Hana Swim bottoms. Take a moment to admire your handiwork and then let us know how it went. We can't wait to see your creations. Please share your makes across social media using hashtag #GSHanaSwim. We can't wait to see what you've created. Happy sewing and swimming from all of us at Greenstyle.